Welcome to Our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law Section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Hello, and welcome to Our Curious Amalgam, the podcast from the American Bar Association Antitrust Law Section. My name is Christina Ma, and today's episode is Who is John Roberti? A conversation with John Roberti. Nearly 4 years ago, Brian Henry, then chair of the ABA Antitrust Law Section, had the radical idea of starting a podcast. He assembled a group of young attorneys to workshop the idea, but it was only with the help of John Roberti that the podcast recorded its first episode in the summer of 2019, and only with the help of John Roberti that the podcast now garners 1,000 plus listens per episode. In this episode of Our Curious Amalgam, we will get to hear from John directly as he makes his exodus from the podcasting committee. Joining me today is incoming chair Alicia Downey. Hey, Alicia.
Hi, Christina.
And welcome, John. A very familiar setting for you, although usually on the other side of things. John, tell us a little bit about the last 3 years as chair of the podcast committee. What have you liked the most? What have you liked the least?
Yeah, no, Christina, thank you. And it's being fired from the podcast is one of the great honors because it means that we're actually have succession, and it's going to continue, and it's better. It's way better now than it was when we started it 3 years ago. When we started it 3 years ago, we did the first episode, and I think I've told this story before, but we did the first episode, and what we did was we came in with a series of written questions and answers, and we read them to each other. It was like story time, except much less interesting, but probably equally likely to put somebody to sleep. And what happened was our producer then came in and said, "Thank you, that was fascinating," took away the scripts and said, "Now talk to each other." And it was sort of that we evolved from there to the point where I'm told from time to time, maybe we should prepare a little bit more than we do. The podcast, I think the great thing about the podcast actually has very little to do with me. It has to do with the fact that we actually listened to the younger lawyers that were smart and creative and incorporated their good ideas into what we were doing. So you asked me about the best, Christy, you were asking me about the best and the worst of it? Is that?
Yes.
Yeah. For you personally.
It was a little bit rough in year one to be on every single one of the episodes every week. We used to record them in a studio with an actual hat. And we would go in and do 6 of them. So it would be 6 or 7 of them. So basically I would give up a day and go into it. And honestly, that was a little bit rough to get that all organized. But to say that's the worst part, it was just a lot of time. It's really been a lot of fun. Best part has been watching the couple things. One, watching the program get way better because of the contributions of so many people. And 2, watching the younger lawyers that I'm working with grow up and, go from being real baby lawyers, people who were just barely out of law school are now, very good practicing lawyers. It's been fun to get reacquainted with people I've known for a long time, like you, Alicia, and have you contribute to the podcast. So that's been the best part.
Yeah, it's I feel like, to your earlier point, we should have all young associates or all young attorneys do podcasts because it helps them gain confidence in their own abilities to speak publicly and to not rely so heavily on scripts, right? I mean, we're lawyers. We want everything to be perfect. And in a podcast, the best podcast is one that it's not scripted.
Yeah, I have to say, too, for anyone listening, John was not fired for cause as chair of the committee. It's a natural progression to rotate out of this responsibility to go on to higher and better things, which he has definitely earned.
Thank you. So I'm not 100% positive it wasn't for cause, but no, and that's really, and I'm not kidding. Being fired is the best part. That means there are other people who are going to take it over. That means it's going to continue, right? that Christina,
Right.
you and I, and the others who started it 3 years ago, Sergey and Nora, it's our legacy. It continues. That's the best part. So I love being fired.
And the other thing I want to say is John's a great role model, not only for the younger lawyers and economists who've been engaged with the program as guests or as vice chairs, but also even for mid-career and older lawyers. You know, the fear of misspeaking is very real among lawyers who work on high-stakes matters all the time. And many of them do come to this with script in hand. They want to read their answers. They want to re-record. And John has been a very good example of sort of this lack of fear and the ability to just say what you know and not get wrapped up in knots about whether you did it perfectly or not. So thank you, John. It's a service to the profession.
So what I would say is this, Alicia. When we talked about doing a farewell episode, my idea was to actually take all of the awkward silences that we've had over 3 years, and there have been many, and just have 30 minutes of complete silence. But people thought I don't think people would have gotten the joke.
Yeah, those silences can be awkward. I'm personally editing them out of my episodes now because they are so cringe.
Well, but you know what? But we were joking about it, but it's part of the process. We have the awkward silence, and Christina, to your point, that's a beautiful thing about the podcast. If you have an awkward silence, that's cool. We'll just put it back together give you a second to think about it and put it back together. It is a great place. It's really easy. And particularly for younger lawyers. And look, I think that was part of the ethic or the ethos that we had at the beginning. Was this was going to be a place where we're going to get people who don't get turns to speak some chances to be heard.
And John, you mentioned legacy. You've left us with quite the legacy. Are there things that you really hope to continue to see as Alicia and I sort of take on the baton? And what do you think we could be doing better?
What I hope to continue to see is the curious hat. Okay, just kidding. Look, what I hope to continue to.
The curious hat lives on. Don't worry. The curious hat lives on.
The metaphorical curious hat.
I am
the metaphorical hat.
I'm a little bit worried about the hat. Look, what I'd love to see the podcast do is to continue with its emphasis on giving people who haven't had turns to speak yet those turns. That correlates very closely with diversity. And I think we've done a pretty good job of getting people with different backgrounds and coming at it from different points of view on. I think one of the areas where I'm proud of what the podcast has done, I hope it continues to do that, is to bring on people with different viewpoints, but those viewpoints that are early in their developments. I'll give you an example, one that I think was a missed opportunity for the section, if being honest. 6 years ago, we started hearing about the neo-Brandeisians, the new way of thinking about enforcement. And the reaction among many people in the section was just to call it antitrust hipsters or hipster antitrust, scoff at it, give it the back of the hand. And you know what? Those folks are in charge now. If we had embraced the ideas, we don't have to agree with them, but if we had embraced the ideas, had a good discussion about them, talked about the principles, we disagree with them. That's okay too. But get the conversation going. I think we as a section would have done a great service to our members. And I think that's what the podcast didn't exist back then. I think that's one of the roles that the podcast can play. Scout out those new ideas, get the people talking about them on. We may, get the conversation started. So anyway, that's what I hope the podcast continues to do.
Yeah, I think it's great. And we've always wanted it to be sort of an open forum for conversation. So Alicia and I have our task cut out for us. But you are not leaving the section and you're not retiring. So what are you doing, John?
So I've been asked to take on a new role in the section. It's a little bit, this is a little bit inside baseball, but for those who are interested, I've been asked to take on a new role in the section as technology officer. What I view that role as being is the opportunity to help bring the great section stuff that we do, the content and all that, to people in a way that's just easier and more convenient and makes things smoother, using technology to really increase access to the section. I think there's some real opportunities. I think some of the things that we did on the podcast, some of the principles here are things that that I would love to be able to talk to people in the section about applying more broadly.
And do you have any high level goals for your first year as tech officer?
Well, there is a tremendous new website that is up that I had very, very little to do with. That really is the work of other people: Anthony Chavez, Chris Hughes, some other, Ilana Katan, many others. I'm going to try to help to keep that up and running, keep that going. I'd love to try to think a little bit about how we can communicate with members in a more efficient and more user-friendly way. And that's going to take some thinking. So that you asked me if that's going to be, that'll be something I'll be thinking about over the course of the year. But I don't think I have anything on that too concrete yet.
Good luck to you. I'm sure you'll do as good a job with that as you've done with this podcast, which is really making a name for itself. You know, when I ask guests if they'd like to be on the podcast, quite a few of them say, "Oh, wow, that would be really cool. I do listen to it." So congratulations and job well done.
When we used to ask people if they wanted to be on the Curious Amalgam, they'd say, "The Curious what? What does that have to do with it? What?" We sometimes get that still, but at least there's less of that now. And at least to your point, I think the team as a whole, right? Our leaders, our co-hosts have done a great job of making the podcast a place where people feel like, yeah, it's okay to come here and bounce around some ideas.
We can't let you go before we ask the questions that we ask of every guest on the show. The first one being, tell us something interesting about yourself that we would not know if we only knew you professionally.
So I'm gonna take some privilege here, and I'm gonna do two. One, both of which are very important, but one is a little more serious than the other. The first thing is, most people don't know, although you might be able to tell from my accent, that I grew up in Delaware County, Pennsylvania. And Delaware County, for those who don't know it, was the site of the program Mayor of Eastham. Every one of my uncles talks just like that. And the beautiful thing about growing up in Delco is, so it's a suburb of Philadelphia. So if you're from Philadelphia, you know that you hate New York and you hate DC because, come on, you're in the middle of them. They don't treat you so well, right? If you're in Delco, the beautiful thing is you're just south of the main line, which is a very nice area. So you hate them too. A great example, I think it's been in some movies. If you want to, again, Silver Linings Playbook is another great way to kind of understand a little bit where I'm coming from. I'll tell this story, maybe get myself in a little bit of trouble, but my wife is Japanese, and we've been married a long time, and she's been a permanent resident for 20 plus years. When she'd always said, I'm never going to denounce I'm never going to become a U.S. citizen because I would have to denounce my Japanese citizenship. I never want to do that while my parents are alive. Well, then Donald Trump won the 2016 presidential election. She decided she needed to vote and, that her parents would get over it. So she went through that process and in the process of that, figured out that she probably needed to take down her Facebook page because she had said some unkind things about the president of the United States at the time. So she took over my long dormant Facebook page, which was populated by all of the people from my high school who didn't want to be friends with me then, but apparently were going to be Facebook friends with me now. That's fine. They were all from Delco. And my wife would do her thing on Facebook, but not being from the area or whatever, would come in and ask me questions like, and it was very important. The year that she did that was the year that the Eagles started to win and ultimately went to the Super Bowl. So over the course of the football season, I would get questions like, Carson Wentz just blew out his knee. all of your friends are saying they're going to line up to donate their knees to Carson Wentz. They know they can't do that, right? And then there would be questions later like, isn't it somebody's First Amendment rights to light things on flyers or be on a pole? Why do they need to grease the whole pole? What's wrong with that? I knew that we had kind of crossed the line when we went to Mass on the day of the Super Bowl up here in Chevy Chase. And the priest at the end of the Mass gave the blessing, and he said, listen, I'm from Washington, like many of us. And today, the New England Patriots are playing our most hated rivals, the Philadelphia Eagles. So today, I'm going to give a blessing to the Patriots so that they can beat the Eagles. And I had a kid up there that was altar serving. And so they do the blessing. They're processing down the center of the church, right? Processing to the back of the church. My kid's in the front with his little cross, My wife pops up, climbs across me and the other two kids, and starts chasing the priest down to the back of the church. I get there just in time for the end of the speech. Something ended like, and God doesn't choose favorites. Now, I tell that story to the people from Delco, and they look at me and they say, where were you? Why? Of course she had no choice. Of course she had to do that.
Of course she had the right.
Problem?
I mean, and also they do pick favorites. It's the Eagles, clearly. But
it's pronounced Eagles, Iggles. Eagles.
Well, I'm sitting here outside of Boston, and I'm afraid it's the Patriots. Now, so John, did you say there was something else that was interesting about you? Or was that woven in that story? Because I kind of lost the plot. But go ahead.
I would say that story was nonlinear. But look, the other one is a little more serious, which is one of the best and worst things that ever happened to me was I have a kid with fairly involved autism. And having a kid with special needs has opened my eyes to so many different things. For one thing, I don't really care if the other ones go to Harvard, to be perfectly honest. It gives you. I know you're from Boston, Alicia, but it gives you real perspective on what's important, what isn't. The second is it really opened my eyes to seeing things through the eyes of others. I have a real now passionate view on making sure that people treat others well, because I think in the back of my mind, I worry about the day that I'm not around and my kid is off on his own, and his brother and sister will be there to help. But if we live in a world where people are not empathetic to others, I worry he's the kid who's going to suffer. So that is, in a sense, that's many people know that about me. But I think that's probably the thing that motivates me more than anything. And like I say, in some ways it was the worst thing because, it's not been easy. But in other ways, it's really been the best thing because it's opened my eyes to so many things. And nobody feels sorry for anybody here. He's a great kid and he's going to be great. But it's what motivates me.
Well, the show wouldn't be a complete episode if we didn't do the Curious Hat with you, John.
And now it's time for the Curious Hat!
For those unfamiliar with this game, what we do is we draw a surprise question out of a virtual hat. And John's question is, if you could host a podcast about any subject, what would you do? Fully funded podcast. You can have any guests you want. You can run as often as you want.
I think it would be nice to have Barack Obama come on and talk a little bit about his legacy. I have some ideas. We could have President Biden on. I have some ideas for him that maybe we could discuss.
That's the answer I'd expect from a political junkie like John. Yep. Okay. That works.
No, look, I mean, if you're talking about an actual antitrust podcast, what I would really love to do, and maybe this is a challenge for you all, is to have the podcast on the next great development, the next great ideology, the next great perspective that's coming. I'd love to try to figure that out. I don't know what it is yet, but when I figure it out, I'll come back to you.
Okay.
Well, John, it has truly been a pleasure working with you these last few years. We will miss you. And I'm sure our listenership feels the same. So to all of our listenership, thanks for spending the time to learn a little bit more about John. And we hope to hear from you and hope you listen to the next episode of Our Curious Amalgam.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.